On March 22, 2024, a group of men armed with assault rifles stormed a crowded theater in Moscow, and you can imagine what happened next. Within hours, the group ISIS-K, the ISIS branch located in Afghanistan and surrounding regions, had claimed responsibility. U.S. officials believe that this is the case as well, though it is still early to make final judgments there. However, if accurate, there is an interesting story here about how both the beginning and the end of this attack connect back to the geopolitical concerns in and around Ukraine. And I am not talking about the fears of a false flag claim that dominated the conversation in the first few hours post-attack. Rather, it is Russia's centuries-old focus along the Black Sea that initially gave ISIS-K the underlying motivation to commit the attack. Only later, due to Russia being distracted in Ukraine, did the group find the proximate ability to do so. And somehow, the situation will ultimately find itself back there. To understand all of this, let's zoom out. Russia is a massive country, but its connections to the global ocean network are precarious. You have a Northern Fleet, a Baltic Fleet, a Pacific Fleet, and of course a Black Sea Fleet. Russia invests a ton of money into each of them as a means of projecting power worldwide, and they love throwing a good parade to show off everything. However, it is the Black Sea Fleet that is the focus of today's story. It is headquartered in Sevastopol, Crimea, and its strategic importance is what motivated Russia to annex the peninsula a decade ago. But take a broader look at where the Black Sea Fleet is situated. Indeed, the Black Sea Fleet plays a critical role in monitoring Russian interests in the Mediterranean region, and it is also just a Suez Canal trip away from taking charge in the broader Middle East and Persian Gulf. Nevertheless, there is one major strategic problem that is constantly in the backs of the minds of Kremlin policymakers. The Black Sea sits behind the Bosporus Strait, and Turkey can shut down passage through there whenever it wants to. Fortunately, humanity is a species that likes to implement treaties, so much so that we have a treaty on how to create treaties, and yes, that is a real thing. Given that, we unsurprisingly have one that regulates the Bosporus Strait. Called the Montreux Convention for the Swiss city where it was signed in 1936. In broad strokes, passage of warships in peacetime is allowed, but in wartime is not allowed. This presents a problem for Russian warships that might be traveling anywhere in this area, and are in need of some tender loving care. Now, among NATO countries, Russia has a relatively good relationship with Turkey. But that is of only minor relief to the Kremlin. If Turkey were to ever deny passage, those needy Russian warships would be stuck going all the way up here or all the way over here. Obviously, a trip all the way out to the Pacific is a ridiculous idea. Meanwhile, heading to the Baltic has come with a new concern over the last year, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and thereby making the waterway all but a NATO lake. The Kremlin had a solution, though. Decades earlier, Soviet strategists also well understood this problem, and long ago developed a countermeasure: the Tartus naval base in Syria. No one would mistake it as having the wonderful accommodations of Sevastopol. But when it came to trying to establish a permanent presence in the Mediterranean, as Russia did in 2013, beggars cannot be choosers. Part of the motivation for this arose the year before, at a time when the Arab Spring was in full bloom. And more than a year after the first tremors in the region, Syria was in a full-blown civil war. Russia kept a close eye on the situation, concerned that if the Assad government were to fall, the successor might expel Russia from Tartus. However, the power vacuum that formed in Syria gave rise to the Islamic State, and, eventually, various offshoots. 3 years later, Russia became concerned enough to directly intervene in the civil war. Russia and the Islamic State were now rival combatants. Fast forward again to 2024. 2 years after launching what was supposed to be a fast, special military operation, Russia found itself pouring way more resources into Ukraine than was imaginable at the start of the conflict, and also found the Bosporus Strait closed to warships, validating the Kremlin's earlier fears that led to the TARDIS installation. It seemed that Turkey disagreed with that special military operation designation, and so the war triggered Montreux to be in full force. The war itself has been a bit of a roller coaster, with Russia initially taking substantial ground in Ukraine's east, but Ukraine managing to hold on. Then Russia struggling in and ultimately retreating from Kyiv. Ukraine then finding further success in a pair of counteroffensives in the fall of 2022, before Russia more recently began seeing slow but incremental gains. This has left Russia unable to cover all of its traditional bases, though. So when things happened, like Sweden and Finland wanting to join NATO, Russia could raise a fuss, but otherwise was handcuffed from taking real measures to stop those things from happening. More pertinent to our conversation, it has forced Russia's National Guard units to be focused on the border with Ukraine, and it means that Russia's various intelligence services are preoccupied with what is happening on that war front. Meanwhile, it is the same old story for militant groups. Extreme violence gets media coverage. Media coverage gets eyeballs. And radicalized individuals might now pursue membership with ISIS-K over other groups. And if you are a group that needs resources to survive, that media coverage might sound like a blessing. If you remember the logic that we have discussed regarding the Houthis in Yemen, or Hamas and Israel, it is those things all over again. Now, it is not like ISIS-K has a shortage of rivals to attack. But when a country that is a major power has its National Guard unit and intelligence services distracted by other things, it is a good reason to target that country and not elsewhere. In fact, the group had previously attacked the Russian embassy in Afghanistan in 2022. More recently, Russia claims to have thwarted many other attacks by the group just this month. Also earlier this month, the United States warned Americans still in Moscow, yes, somehow there are still some there, to avoid crowded places, including theaters. Putin described the message as a U.S. provocation against Russia, and that such warnings resemble outright blackmail and the intention to intimidate and destabilize our society. They also came at a time when Russia was in the midst of an election season. This was a moment when the incumbent wished to convey a message of strength and unity in an otherwise difficult time of war. Now, Russia will respond to the attack. How many resources the Kremlin can dedicate to that task, though, is a separate question. And whether the net gains to recruitment for ISIS-K will outweigh the losses that Russia causes remains to be seen. The group had already endured many countermeasures from both the United States and from Afghanistan, perhaps leaving it with a need for more support. And that is how we ended up at March 22nd. What happens next in Russia will raise yet more complications. The following morning, Putin went on television to deliver his condolences to the victims of the attack. He also described the initial findings of Russia's investigation, namely that the perpetrators were trying to escape to Ukraine, and, without explicitly saying so, seemed to suggest that Ukrainian officials were trying to give the perpetrators safe harbor. As always, I am not an intelligence organization, and so I will not be commenting on the accuracy of those claims. But this does connect to a long-running concern in the West. When Putin announced what might be now Russia's first large-scale mobilization, here in September 2022, his popularity took a brief hit, as Russian citizens wondered whether they might be heading to the front lines. His numbers eventually recovered, but concerns about it in the Kremlin never fully faded away. Consequently, mobilizing in the run-up to the March election was off the table. Even if Russia's managed democracy could still guarantee a public victory for Putin, and by a very large margin, There was no desire to create a rallying call for protesters. But with the election now over, the Kremlin can refocus its priorities to winning the war in Ukraine, which may very well require having to send substantially more troops westward. To be clear, with Ukraine strapped for arms support from the West, Russia already has been making incremental gains over the last few months. The problem is that those Russian gains have come at an incredible cost of manpower. You can see where this is going. A prerequisite for continuing at that pace is a steady stream of warm bodies, which runs up against the Kremlin's concern that round 2 of mobilizations will be deeply unpopular. Thus, anything that can tie the theater attack to Ukraine may help smooth over that process. In turn, what we will be observing in the upcoming days is a very public argument among intelligence organizations about exactly what happened. How compelling that evidence is overall does not matter. Instead, the real thing to watch for is what Russian citizens believe. That will determine how open they are to mobilization, which will then determine how many Russians head to Ukraine, which will then determine how much of a headache Kyiv will soon be facing. Still, this is not without risk to the Kremlin. Part of the social contract in Russia is that if you stay away from politics, then politics stays away from you. Tying the Moscow attack to Ukraine shatters that contract. Which way the narrative sways is something that we will see for ourselves in the days to come. If you want to know more about the war, I have a couple of in-depth books on the subject. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.